She had been invisible for 6 years, silent, obedient, erased. But tonight, Nyla Brooks walked into that ballroom wearing sapphire and steel, and every single person in that room stopped breathing. Her husband hadn't looked at her in years. Tonight, he couldn't look away. And that terrified him more than any federal investigation, any enemy, any gun ever pressed against his skull. Because the woman he'd buried under contracts and silence had just risen, and she was done being small. Stay with me until the end. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The dress had been hanging in her closet for 4 months. Nyla Brooks had bought it on a Tuesday in March when she'd felt something rare and dangerous stir inside her chest. Something that felt almost like hope. Sapphire blue. Heavy silk. Cut to hold a woman's real body instead of apologize for it. She'd carried the bag home from the boutique, hung it on the back of the closet door, and then stood there for a long time just looking at it, the way you look at a door you're not sure you're allowed to open. She didn't wear it that night, or the next. She told herself she was waiting for the right occasion. What she meant was she was waiting to feel worthy of it. 6 years. That's how long Nyla had lived inside Damien Castell's estate, a property so large it had its own name, Raven Hill, stamped on brass plates at the iron gate, like it was a country unto itself. 12 bedrooms, 3 kitchens, a garden that a full-time groundskeeper tended with more care than Damien had ever directed at his wife. The house was beautiful the way a museum is beautiful. Impressive, cold, and designed so that you never quite feel like you belong in it. She had arrived at 27 with 2 suitcases and a contract she hadn't fully read. She was 33 now. The suitcases were long gone, but the contract remained, filed somewhere in Damien's private office behind a door she was never asked to enter. The marriage had been arranged the way powerful families arrange things, quietly, efficiently, and without the inconvenience of emotion. Her father, a man who moved in circles adjacent to wealth without ever quite reaching it, had made an agreement with the Castell organization during a period when her family needed something only Damien's money could provide. The details had never been explained to Nyla fully. She'd been 26 when the conversation happened, sitting in her father's study while the 2 men talked over her head about terms and timelines, and she'd understood then what she was. She was a solution to a problem, clean, legal, and quiet. She'd told herself she could survive it, that she was smart enough and strong enough to keep herself intact inside a marriage built on strategy rather than love. She'd been wrong about how much of herself she would slowly, quietly lose. There was no dramatic moment when it happened. No single fight, no explosion, just years of small erosions. The way ocean water takes away a cliff face, not in one violent crash, but in 10,000 patient laps of cold water. Damien never raised his voice at her. He was too controlled for that. He simply treated her the way a man treats furniture he no longer notices. Present, functional, irrelevant. He didn't eat meals with her. He didn't introduce her at events when he bothered to bring her at all. When colleagues visited the estate, she was expected to appear briefly, smile without speaking too much, and then disappear back into the rooms designated for her use. The social circles Damien moved through were merciless about her appearance. She knew it because she wasn't deaf. She'd heard the whispers at the 2 galas she'd attended in the first year. The careful, studied cruelty of women who wore their thinness like armor and used it as a weapon. She was too much, too broad, too soft, too visible in all the wrong ways. The word they never said aloud but always communicated was embarrassing. She was an embarrassing wife for a man like Damien Castell, and everyone seemed to understand this, including, eventually, Nyla herself. So she had stopped attending, stopped asking to attend, stopped suggesting it. She had built a small, careful life inside Raven Hill, reading, tending the section of garden she'd claimed as her own, occasionally driving herself into the city to sit in coffee shops where no one knew who she was married to. She had a housekeeper she genuinely liked named Rosa, who was in her 60s and had the particular warmth of a woman who had survived enough to stop pretending life was something other than what it was. Rosa brought her tea without being asked and never, in 6 years, made a single comment about Nyla's body, her marriage, or the long evenings she spent alone. That was the kindest relationship in Nyla's daily life. A paid employee's quiet compassion. She had stopped letting herself feel the full weight of that truth a long time ago because the weight of it was crushing. The invitation to the Belmont Foundation Gala arrived on a Wednesday in a thick cream envelope addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Damien Castell. She'd almost left it on the foyer table for him. That had been her instinct. Set it down, walk away, let him decide whether she existed enough to bring. She'd stood there for almost a full minute with the envelope in her hands. Then she'd opened it herself. The Belmont Foundation. Healthcare access for underserved communities. She'd actually worked in nonprofit health advocacy before her marriage. 3 years at an organization in Chicago that she'd loved with the specific passionate devotion you give to work that means something. She'd had to leave when the marriage required relocation, and she'd never found a way back in. Reading the Belmont Foundation's mission printed on the inside flap of that invitation, she'd felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a clean name for. Not joy, not grief. Something more complicated than either. She'd gone upstairs, opened the closet, taken the sapphire dress off the hanger. She told Rosa she would be attending the gala. Rosa looked at her the way you look at someone who just said something you've been waiting years to hear. "Good," she said, without elaboration, and went back to folding linen. She did not tell Damien. He found out the night of the event when he came downstairs in his tuxedo and found her in the foyer in the sapphire dress with her hair pinned and pearl earrings at her ears, and her chin at an angle that was new, or maybe not new, maybe just returned. His face did something complicated that she didn't have time to interpret because she was already picking up her bag. "The car is coming at 7, she said. He looked at her. Just looked. Something passed across his expression that she couldn't identify because she was out of practice reading him, and because she'd decided 3 hours ago that what he thought of how she looked was no longer a thing she was available to care about. "I didn't know you planned to attend," he said. "I know," she said. The car came at 7. They rode to the Belmont Gala in the same vehicle and said nothing. 12 minutes of silence on a Thursday evening, the city lights sliding past the tinted windows, Nyla watching the streets and working to keep her breathing even. She was not calm. Her hands were folded in her lap, and her knuckles were not quite white, but almost. She had not been in a room full of people like this in over 2 years, and her body remembered the last time. The whispers, the tilted chins, the particular social performance of women who wanted her to feel small. She thought, "If I run from this, I will never stop running." She thought, "I bought this dress, and I have been waiting 4 months, and I am going." She got out of the car. The Belmont Gala was held in the grand ballroom of the Harwick Hotel, all pale marble and warm chandeliers, and the contained roar of 300 people dressed in money. Damien was immediately absorbed by 2 men near the entrance who needed his attention, and without a word he moved toward them and left her standing alone at the edge of the room. She stood there for exactly 4 seconds. Then she walked in. She did not hug the walls. She did not keep her eyes down. She walked through the center of that room at a pace that was deliberate without being aggressive, and she was aware, acutely, uncomfortably aware, of the way eyes moved toward her and some of them stayed. She felt the familiar heat of being looked at by people deciding what category to put her in, and she breathed through it one quiet breath at a time and kept walking. She found the bar and ordered sparkling water, and she stood there and she looked at the room the way she used to look at rooms, like a woman who had information to offer, not apology. The first person who spoke to her was a man named Gerald Ashworth, who turned out to be the regional director of a hospital network she actually knew by reputation. He asked if she'd been connected with Belmont long. She said no, but that she'd followed their work for years. And then she started talking, really talking, from the part of her that used to be her whole self, about healthcare access gaps in underserved urban communities, about the specific failures of outreach programming in areas without strong transportation infrastructure, about a model she'd observed in Chicago that had produced measurable outcomes. Gerald Ashworth listened with the focused attention of a man who does not normally adjust his posture in the middle of a conversation and was now adjusting his posture. He introduced her to a woman named Dr. Carmen Reyes. Dr. Reyes introduced her to 2 others. By 9 o'clock, Nyla was at the center of a conversation that had drawn 7 people, and she had stopped being aware of her dress or her body or who in that room might be cataloging her appearance for later cruelty. She was just thinking, just talking, just existing in the way she used to exist before she'd let herself be compressed into silence. Across the room, Damien Castell held a glass of scotch and did not drink it. He was watching her, had been watching her for the better part of 40 minutes without quite realizing he was doing it, and then all at once realizing it very clearly and not moving anyway. He knew the people surrounding her. Gerald Ashworth was one of the most connected men in regional healthcare philanthropy. Dr. Reyes had just completed a nationally recognized study on maternal mortality disparities. These were not people who engaged in polite ballroom conversation as social charity. These were people who engaged when they found something worth engaging with. He watched his wife throw her head back and laugh at something someone said, not the careful, managed half-smile she offered at the 2 galas she'd attended years ago, but a real laugh, the kind that takes up space. And he felt something move through him that he did not know how to name. It was not pride exactly, though there was something in that neighborhood. It was more uncomfortable than pride. It was more like the sensation of realizing you have been wrong about something for a very long time. He had a specific memory, sudden and unwelcome. The second month of their marriage, Nyla had tried to tell him about her old work in Chicago. They'd been eating dinner at opposite ends of a long table, and she'd been talking about something she'd implemented, some outreach model, and he'd made a sound of acknowledgement that was not really acknowledgement at all, and redirected the conversation to something related to his business, and she had gone quiet in the way that people go quiet when they understand they are not being heard, and she had not brought it up again. Not once in 6 years. He had not thought about that moment in years. He was thinking about it now. He did not move toward her. What he felt was not yet anything he knew how to act on, and Damien Castell was a man who did not act on things until he understood them. So he stood where he was and watched the woman he had married talking to a room full of people who were genuinely interested in what she had to say, and he drank his scotch and felt the particular discomfort of a man confronting the gap between who he believed himself to be and what the evidence actually showed. Near the end of the evening, she found him. She didn't have to. She could have taken a separate car home, and the distance between them would have remained exactly what it had been for years. But she walked up to where he stood, and she looked at him, and she didn't look the way she used to look. Something had reorganized behind her eyes. Gerald Ashworth invited me to sit on a Belmont Foundation advisory committee, she said. Not asking, not seeking his reaction, just stating a fact the way you state facts that are already decided. Damien looked at her. That's significant, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He wanted to say something else. He could feel the shape of it somewhere. Some sentence that was not quite an apology and not quite a compliment and not quite an acknowledgement of the last 6 years. But he couldn't find the words, and she didn't wait for them. She turned and went to collect her coat, and he stood there with the shape of the unspoken thing heavy in his chest like a stone that had been there a long time and only now was too big to ignore. She didn't know it yet, but the events of that evening had been observed by more than just her husband. 2 men near the entrance who were not guests of the gala and were not on any attendance list had watched her arrival and her conversations and had taken photographs with discreet cameras, and their interest was not in Nyla herself, but in every person she'd spoken with, cross-referencing names, cataloging connections, building a picture that was almost a year in the making. Because the federal investigation into the Castell financial network had been ongoing for 11 months, and Nyla Brooks Castell's name was on 47 documents that the investigators' team had flagged for review. She climbed into the car unaware of any of this, the city lights moving past the windows again, and she felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could accurately remember. She felt like herself, which is exactly when everything started to break apart. 3 days after the gala, a car she didn't recognize sat parked on the street outside the estate's main gate for 5 hours. She noticed it from the garden. Dark sedan, tinted windows, the particular quality of stillness that isn't accidental. She watched it for a while and then told herself she was being paranoid and went back inside. Rosa noticed it too. Rosa said nothing, but her face said something, the way Rosa's face always spoke when her mouth was being careful. That same week, Nyla received a text from a number she recognized after a moment's confusion. Elias Carter, a friend from her undergraduate years, a man she hadn't spoken to in almost 4 years. The message was simple. Hey, I heard you were back in the social world. I'm in the city for 6 weeks. Coffee? She stared at the text for a long time. Elias was the kind of person who had known her before, who carried memories of the woman she used to be. Passionate, sharp-tongued, working 80-hour weeks because she believed the work mattered. He'd been her closest friend in college. The friendship had faded gradually as her marriage had compressed her life inward, the way distance fades things without any single dramatic moment of rupture. She typed back, Thursday at 11. You know the place on Marchetti Street? His response came in 40 seconds. Still the same Nyla. See you Thursday. She put her phone down and for a moment she just sat with that. Still the same Nyla, letting it be a true thing instead of an accusation. But the night before her Thursday meeting with Elias, something happened that unraveled the small, careful warmth she'd allowed herself to feel. She was passing Damien's private study on the second floor. She rarely went to that wing, had learned in the first year that the unspoken geography of the house meant that corridor was his. When she heard voices, not raised voices, but the specific low-controlled urgency of men discussing something they did not want overhead, she didn't stop walking. She kept her pace even and continued to the end of the hall. But she had caught enough of 3 words, words spoken in Damien's exact voice, clear and certain, to stop breathing for a moment in the stairwell. She signed it. She stood in the stairwell for a long time after the voices faded. The house settled around her with its old money creaks and its curated silences, and she pressed her back against the wall and asked herself what she actually knew and what she suspected and what the difference was. She thought about the contract she'd signed 6 years ago. The pages she hadn't fully read. The sections her father had told her were standard. She thought, I need a lawyer, not Damien's lawyer, her own. She took out her phone and began searching. She found a name. A woman, Margot Hines, independent family law and contracts attorney with a specific background in complex matrimonial agreements. She sent an inquiry at 11:30 at night from her phone's private browser and did not save the search history. The appointment was confirmed by morning. She was going to find out what she had signed. She was going to find out what she signed it meant. And something in the still, tired, long-waiting part of her already knew that what she was about to learn would be the thing she could not come back from. Margot Hines kept her office on the 14th floor of a building that had no relationship whatsoever to anything connected to the Castell name. Nyla had checked. She'd spent an hour the night before the appointment cross-referencing the firm's client list against every company name she'd heard Damien mention in 6 years, every subsidiary she'd seen on documents that passed through the estate's mail, every name dropped at the rare dinners she'd attended. Nothing overlapped. She was as certain as she could be without being certain at all, and that was going to have to be enough. She took a cab. Not the estate's car service, not her own car with its GPS that fed into the property's security system. A regular cab she hailed 3 blocks from the gate after telling Rosa she was going for a walk. Rosa had looked at her the way Rosa sometimes looked at her, like a woman reading weather, and said nothing. The cab smelled like pine air freshener and old upholstery, and Nyla sat in the back with her hands in her lap and watched the city move past and worked on her breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the kind of deliberate breathing that means you are afraid of something and have decided to go toward it anyway. Margot Hines was 51 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses she kept pushing up her nose, and she had the specific quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent decades sitting across from individuals in the worst moments of their lives. She did not smile too much. She did not perform warmth. She shook Nyla's hand, gestured to the chair across from her desk, and said, "You brought the documents?" Nyla had photographed every page of the marriage contract 3 nights ago. She'd waited until after midnight, gone into the filing room adjacent to Damien's study with her phone and her heart slamming against her ribs, and photographed 47 pages by the light of her phone screen. Then she'd printed them at a FedEx store 2 miles from the estate, paid cash, and carried the folded papers home in the bottom of a reusable grocery bag. She put the stack on Margot's desk. Margot read. She didn't skim. She went page by page, occasionally making small notations on a legal pad, occasionally pausing to reread a section, And she did all of this in a silence so complete that the only sounds in the office were the distant muffled city noise from the windows and the soft scratch of Margot's pen. Nyla sat across from her and said nothing, and tried not to watch the attorney's face too closely for tells. But she watched anyway because she was human and afraid and needed to know. 22 minutes in, Margot set down her pen. She took off her reading glasses. She looked at Nyla directly. "How much do you know about what you signed?" Nyla's throat tightened. "Tell me what I don't know." Margot picked up 3 specific pages and laid them on the desk facing Nyla, her finger pointing to a section of dense legal language in paragraph 19, subsection C. This clause, it's written as standard asset protection language, which is why it doesn't flag immediately. But what it actually does is bind any property held in your name during the duration of the marriage to a network of financial instruments managed by Castell Holdings, including, she moved her finger down, any property inherited prior to the marriage or during it. Nyla felt something go cold in her chest. My mother's house. If you exit the marriage before the 7-year mark without Castell's written release of this clause, yes. The property would be subject to liens from the holding company. Effectively, you'd lose it. Her mother had died 4 years ago. The house, a narrow 3-bedroom in a neighborhood that used to be considered marginal and was now considered up and coming, was the only thing of her mother's that Nyla had. It smelled like her mother still, or she imagined it did. She'd been back 3 times since the funeral, sitting in the front room with her coat on because she couldn't make herself stay long enough to take it off. "There's more," Margot said. "Tell me." Margot turned to page 31. Your signature appears as a co-signatory on what's described here as a routine financial authorization, standard language buried in a block of administrative clauses. But this authorization was broad enough that it was subsequently used, and I would need documentation to confirm this, but the language supports it, as legal cover for a series of asset transfers through Castell Holdings over the past 4 years. Your name on this document makes you a nominal participant in those transfers. The room felt different than it had 60 seconds ago. The air pressure had changed, or maybe Nyla's ears had changed, because everything sounded slightly farther away. What kind of transfers? Margot held her gaze. The kind that federal investigators are interested in. Nyla heard herself ask, in a voice that sounded steadier than she felt. How do you know about a federal investigation? Because 2 weeks ago I was contacted by an attorney representing a party adjacent to the Castell organization who was seeking representation, and I declined for conflict reasons. But I'm aware the investigation exists. Margot leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Castell, I'm going to ask you directly. Did you knowingly participate in any financial activities related to Castell Holdings beyond signing what was presented to you as routine marital documentation? No. Did anyone explain to you the scope of what you were signing at any point? No. My father told me the contract was standard. The attorney present at signing was Castell's attorney. She paused. I didn't have independent representation. Margot wrote something on her legal pad. Then she looked up. We can challenge the unfair clauses. The asset binding language has vulnerabilities, particularly given that you had no independent counsel at signing. It won't be fast, and it won't be simple, but it's challengeable. She paused. But I need you to understand something clearly. If this investigation develops the way these things tend to develop, your name on those documents is going to attract attention regardless of your actual knowledge or intent. You need to be ahead of it, not behind it. Nyla sat with that for a moment. The city moved outside the windows, indifferent and continuous. What does being ahead of it look like? She asked. Margot told her. She took a different cab home. She sat in the back and did not work on her breathing this time because there was no managing what was moving through her body right now. It was too large and too many chambered for controlled breathing to address. It was fury and grief, and something underneath both of those that was almost a kind of clarity, the terrible clear-eyed feeling of a person who has finally stopped pretending they don't know what they know. She had been used. The marriage, the contract, the silence, the 6 years of managed invisibility had not just been cold or neglectful or even cruel in the way she'd understood it. It had been structural. She had been a legal instrument. Her name, her signature, her existence as Damien Castell's wife had been a functional component of a financial architecture she had never been permitted to understand. She thought about her father, she thought about the conversation in his study, the two men talking over her head. She thought about whether her father had known the full scope of what he'd arranged. And then she thought, it doesn't matter. It happened. I signed it. My name is on 47 documents, and I didn't read them. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and looked out the window at the passing city and did not cry. She was too dry for crying right now. The grief would come later, she knew that, but right now she was operating in the region past grief, where things just become facts. She met Elias Carter the following Thursday, as planned. The cafe on Marchetti Street was small and slightly shabby, in the way of places that have been good for a long time and know it. Mismatched chairs, the smell of serious coffee, regulars who brought books. Elias was already there when she arrived, seated at the corner table he'd always preferred in college because it had sightlines to the door, a habit from an old neighborhood he'd grown up in. He looked the same, a little more gray at the temples. The same direct, unhurried way of existing in a room that had always made Nyla feel like the pace of things was negotiable. He stood when he saw her. He didn't make a performance of it, just stood, the way you stand for someone who matters. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. They sat down and ordered and didn't immediately perform the catching up ritual, the greatest hit summary of the missing years, because they had never been that kind of friends. They had always been the kind of friends who could move directly to the actual conversation, which was the rare and valuable thing. "You look different," Elias said, not unkindly, observationally. "From the Gala thing?" "From the picture someone posted from the Gala, yeah. But also right now, you look like you're carrying something." She looked at him across the table. "I am." "Okay. I can't tell you most of it." "Okay," he said again, without pressing, without the wounded performance of someone who expects access. This was what she had always trusted about Elias. He did not need things from her. "I need to ask you something," she said, "about your work." Elias was a financial forensics consultant, had been for 8 years, working primarily with legal teams on complex asset investigations. She had thought about this on the cab ride over, the strange geometry of it, an old friend with exactly the kind of knowledge she needed appearing in her life exactly now. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like recognition. "Nyla," he said carefully. "I'm not asking you to do anything," she said. "I just want to understand, hypothetically, how a name on a co-signatory authorization can be used as legal cover for asset transfers over a multi-year period, and whether that creates actual criminal exposure for the person whose name it is." Elias was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup on the saucer without lifting it. "How long ago did you sign? 6 years? Did you receive any benefit from the transfers? Any direct financial movement into accounts in your name?" "No, I have a household account. Damien funds it. That's all I've ever had access to." He looked at her steadily. "Hypothetically. Hypothetically. Hypothetically," he said, "a person in that position, no independent counsel at signing, no financial benefit, no active participation, would likely be categorized as an unwitting instrument rather than a co-conspirator. But hypothetically, that person would need to establish that very clearly and very quickly if an investigation were already underway. Because prosecutors build narratives, and a name on a document is a name on a document until someone demonstrates otherwise." She nodded slowly. "How long has this been going on?" he asked. "I don't know the full scope." A pause. "A long time, I think." Elias looked at her with the careful attention of a man doing math. "Are you safe?" The question landed differently than she expected. Not in the dramatic sense, not physically safe, but the way he said it encompassed something larger, something about the whole architecture of her daily life. "Are you safe?" Was the ground under her feet real? "I'm working on it," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers for just a moment. Not romantic, not fraught, just the specific warmth of a person reminding another person that they are not alone in the physical universe. And then he pulled his hand back and picked up his coffee. "Whatever you need," he said. She walked back to where she could hail a cab, and she stood on the sidewalk in the cool air, and she thought, whatever you need. When was the last time someone had said that to her and meant it without condition, without the subtext of what they required in return? She thought, too long. She got home to find Damien's car already in the drive, which was unusual for a Thursday afternoon. She went through the side entrance, the one that opened near the kitchen, and she heard voices again, this time in the formal sitting room, and this time she recognized both of them, Damien's, and Marcus Fell, who was Damien's chief legal officer, and a man who had, in 6 years, looked directly at Nyla a total of perhaps 4 times. She did not slow down. She walked to the kitchen, poured herself water, stood at the counter, and listened through the partially open door to the sitting room. She caught fragments, enough fragments. The timeline has to hold through the anniversary. Damien's voice, flat and deliberate. Everything depends on the 7th-year clause remaining intact. Marcus Fell's voice, lower. If she starts asking questions, she won't. A beat. She never has. Nyla set her water glass down on the counter very carefully because her hand was not entirely steady and she didn't want to make a sound. She stood there in the kitchen, in her own kitchen in this house that had never been her home, and she breathed through what was happening in her chest. She never has. 6 years of silence interpreted not as damage, not as the gradual extinction of a person, but as proof of reliability, evidence of a compliant instrument. She won't ask questions because she never has, and isn't that a useful quality in a wife whose signature you need and whose voice you don't? She walked upstairs. She went to her room and she sat on the edge of the bed and she looked at her hands for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and she texted Margot Hines. I need to accelerate. Can we meet Monday? Margot replied in 11 minutes. Monday, 9 a.m. Don't communicate about this from any device connected to the estate network. Nyla looked at her phone. Then she looked at the router on her desk, the one the estate's IT service had installed, the one she'd used for 6 years to connect to the internet because it was simply there and she had simply used it, the way you use things in a life built for you by someone else. She turned off her Wi-Fi, switched to cellular data. She sat with the peculiar sensation of having just done something small that felt enormous. The weekend passed the way weekends at Raven Hill always passed, in the managed silence of 2 people in a large house performing the absence of relationship. Damien moved through his schedule, his calls, his invisible empire. Nyla moved through hers, and if her movements were slightly more deliberate now, if her attention was differently calibrated, if she spent more time than usual in the section of the garden where the sightlines to the house were limited, he didn't notice. He never noticed. On Sunday evening, he appeared in the doorway of the sitting room where she was reading and said, with the tone of a man reporting a schedule change, "There's a Castell Foundation board dinner next Saturday. I'd like you to attend." She looked up from her book. This was new. He had not asked her to attend anything in over 18 months. Why? She asked. Something in his face shifted. Not much, barely anything, but she caught it. The Belmont event. People have asked after you. She held his gaze for a moment. I'll think about it, she said. She watched something move behind his eyes that she couldn't fully read, and then he nodded once and left the doorway. And she listened to his footsteps move down the corridor and she thought, he wants me visible now. Something has changed in what I'm useful for. And that thought, the cold functional clarity of it, moved through her like ice water. Monday morning, she was in Margot's office at 9 sharp. What she was not prepared for was the other person in the room. A man she didn't know sat in the chair to the left of Margot's desk. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, a plain gray suit, and the particular quality of stillness that is not natural stillness, but trained stillness. The kind that belongs to people who have learned to take up as little atmospheric space as possible in order to observe. Mrs. Castell, Margot said, this is Agent Warren Cole. He reached out to me last week through proper channels. He knows you have independent representation. He's here because he asked to be, and you have every right to ask him to leave. Nyla stood in the doorway of the office for a moment. She looked at Warren Cole, He looked back at her with the neutral, patient expression of a man who had done this before. "Federal?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am," Cole said. "Financial crimes. We've been building a case against the Castell organization for 11 months. She walked in. She sat down. She placed her bag on the floor beside her chair with great deliberateness, like a person planting a flag. "My client has not agreed to anything," Margot said clearly. "She's here to listen." "Understood," Cole said. He opened a folder on his knee. He did not look at the folder. He looked at Nyla. "We're not here because of you, Mrs. Castell. I want to be very clear about that. Your name appears on documentation that is material to our case, but our interest is in the organization's structure and the individuals who designed and operated it, not in people who were used by it." "Used," she said. The word sat in her mouth with a specific texture. "That's our assessment of your position, yes." He paused. "But I'd be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you that without your cooperation in establishing the context of your involvement, how documents were presented to you, what you were told, what you weren't told, your position remains technically ambiguous in the record. And technically ambiguous is not a comfortable place to be when a case of this size reaches the indictment stage." Nyla sat very still. She thought about Damien's voice through the door. She never has. She thought about the sitting room, Marcus Fell's low, urgent voice, the seventh-year clause remaining intact. She thought about her mother's house. She looked at Warren Cole and said, "If I cooperate to establish the context of my involvement, only that, only what's necessary to establish my own position, what does that look like?" Cole glanced at Margot. Margot gave Nyla a small nod. "This is the right question." "It looks like a series of recorded interviews," Cole said. "You walk us through the signing process, the documents, what you were told, and by whom. You provide whatever corroborating records you have access to. You answer questions truthfully and within the scope of your actual knowledge. Nothing beyond that." "And my mother's property?" Cole looked at her steadily. "That's a civil matter. My office doesn't have authority over it." A pause. "But a documented record of coercive contract terms, obtained under conditions where you had no independent counsel, is the kind of thing that tends to be useful in civil proceedings." She sat with that for a long moment. The city moved outside the windows. The morning light came in at a specific angle and lay across the carpet in a long, pale rectangle, and Nyla looked at it because she needed somewhere to put her eyes, while the largest decision of her life assembled itself inside her. She thought, "I did not build this empire. I was never asked if I wanted to be part of it. I was handed a pen and told where to sign, and then I was put away like a tool in a drawer." She thought, "My mother planted a garden in front of that house on Calloway Street and watered it every morning for 30 years. She looked up. "I want everything in writing," she said. "The scope of my cooperation, the limits, the protections, everything, before I say one more word." Margot was already uncapping her pen. And somewhere across the city, in the glass and marble offices of Castell Holdings, a man who had spent 6 years believing his wife would never ask questions had no idea that she was no longer the woman who wouldn't. The written agreement took 9 days. 9 days of back and forth between Margot and the federal legal team, 9 days of Nyla sitting inside Raven Hill performing normalcy with the precision of a woman who has learned that survival sometimes looks exactly like submission. She attended the Castell Foundation board dinner on Saturday, as Damien had asked. She wore a dark green dress and spoke when spoken to, and smiled at the right intervals, and ate almost nothing because her stomach had been rejecting food with any regularity since the Monday meeting in Margot's office. Nobody noticed the not eating. Nobody at that table had ever cataloged what Nyla Brooks Castell put in her mouth, unless it was to comment on the quantity. She sat beside Damien for 3 hours and watched him work a room from a seated position the way he always had. The controlled warmth, the precise attention deployed like a tool, the laugh that arrived exactly when social architecture required it. She had spent 6 years studying this performance from a distance. Sitting this close to it, she noticed things she hadn't before. The way his jaw tightened for exactly half a second when Marcus Fell said something across the table that landed wrong. The way his hand moved to his water glass when a name she didn't recognize came up in conversation. A reflexive gesture, controlled but real, the body's honest response to what the face was working to conceal. He was afraid of something, not the vague, ambient fear of a powerful man managing risk, specific fear, with a specific object. She filed it and said nothing. On the drive home, he said, without looking at her, "You were good tonight." "I'm always good," she said. A pause. Outside, the city slid past in amber and dark. "Nyla, I'm tired, Damien." Flat, honest, final. He didn't say anything else. She watched the gate of Raven Hill open as the car pulled in, and she thought, 9 more days, give or take. 9 days and she would have a signed document defining the exact perimeter of what she owed these people. And then she could begin the long process of extracting her name, her mother's house, and what remained of herself from the wreckage of this arrangement. 9 days. She would not get 9 days. On the 5th day, Rosa wasn't at the estate when Nyla came downstairs at 7:15 in the morning. Rosa was always there before 7. Had been for the 3 years she'd worked at Raven Hill. Always present, tea already started, the kitchen carrying the particular warmth of a space that has been inhabited by someone who understands that warmth is itself a form of care. The kitchen was cold. The tea had not been started. Nyla stood in the doorway for a moment, registering the absence the way you register the absence of a sound you didn't realize you'd been depending on. She called Rosa's cell. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She told herself, illness, a family matter, something ordinary. She made her own tea and stood at the kitchen window watching the morning garden and tried to hold on to ordinary. At 9:45, her phone rang. The number was Rosa's, but when she answered, it wasn't Rosa's voice. It was a man's voice, someone she didn't know, who identified himself as Rosa's son and told her that Rosa had slipped on stairs at her home the previous evening and was at St. Cabrini Medical with a fractured hip and would not be returning to work for the foreseeable future. Nyla asked if Rosa was all right. The son said she was stable but shaken. Nyla asked for the hospital's information, wrote it down, told the son to please tell his mother she would come by when Rosa was up for visitors. She hung up and stood with the phone in her hand. She stood there too long enough for the rational case for coincidence to assemble itself, and then, slowly, begin to develop cracks. Rosa had worked in this house for 3 years. She was careful. She was a 63-year-old woman who had navigated decades of life with a physical competence that comes from never having had the luxury of being careless. She did not slip on stairs, and she had looked at Nyla 3 nights ago. The night after the board dinner, when Nyla had come home and gone quietly to the kitchen for water, with an expression that Nyla had catalogued and set aside and was now retrieving from storage with entirely different eyes. Rosa had looked like a woman who knew something was coming. Nyla set her phone on the counter. She breathed. She thought about what she knew versus what she suspected, versus what she could prove. And she thought about Margot Hines saying your name on those documents is going to attract attention regardless of your actual knowledge or intent. And she thought about Warren Cole's trained stillness. And she thought about the router she'd stopped using. And she thought, what if the 9 days was already too long? What if they already know I know? At 2 in the afternoon, she drove herself to the FedEx store and used the public computer to send Margot a message from the private email account they'd established. Timeline has changed. Something has happened. I need to know where we are on the agreement. Margot's response came 40 minutes later, down to final language on 2 clauses. 48 hours, maybe 72. What happened? Nyla typed, I'm not sure yet. I'll explain in person. And then, because she needed to say it to someone who would understand the weight of it, be careful who knows about this meeting. Margot replied with 2 words, already am. She drove home. She pulled into the estate and sat in the car in the private garage for 5 minutes before going inside. And in those 5 minutes, she did the thing she had been avoiding doing since the Monday morning meeting. She thought about her father. She thought about the study in his house, the 2 men talking, the arrangement. She thought about whether a man who loved his daughter and also needed money was capable of fully understanding what he was consenting to on her behalf. And she thought the answer was probably yes, and probably he had not let himself understand it fully, which was its own form of knowing, which was its own form of choosing. She had not spoken to her father in 4 months. Their relationship had become a series of polite phone calls on birthdays and holidays. the kind of communication that maintains the form of a relationship, while both parties understand the substance has long since departed. She thought about calling him now. She thought about what she would even ask. She thought, what did you know and when did you know it? And she thought, I'm not ready for that answer yet. I need to still be functional for the next 72 hours. She went inside. She went upstairs. She sat at her desk and opened a book and read the same paragraph 6 times. That evening, Damien came to her room. He knocked, which was unusual. He typically appeared in doorways or didn't appear at all. The knock was a formality she hadn't been afforded before, and its presence now registered as data she didn't know yet how to interpret. "Come in," she said. He came in. He stood just inside the doorway in his shirt and tie, jacket already removed, which meant he'd been home for at least an hour before coming here. He looked at her at the desk with the book in her hand, and something moved across his face that she was beginning to recognize. The thing she'd first seen at the gala, the thing that was not quite guilt and not quite recognition, but occupied the territory between them. "I heard about Rosa," he said. "I'm sorry. I know you were close." She looked at him steadily. "Were you?" "A beat." "Was I what?" "Sorry." She held his gaze. "Are you sorry about Rosa?" Something shifted in his expression. Not anger. Something more interior than anger. Something that looked almost like the early stages of being caught, which was not a look she had ever seen on Damien Castell's face in 6 years. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm asking a direct question. I find I'm more interested in direct questions lately." She set the book down. "Did something happen to Rosa, or did something happen to Rosa?" The silence that followed was 8 seconds long. She counted them. In those 8 seconds, Damien's face did several things in rapid succession that she catalogued with the detached precision of a woman who has just moved past the point where she is managing her own fear. "She fell," he said. "It's an unfortunate accident." "Yes," Nyla said. "It is." He looked at her for a moment longer, and she let him look, and she gave him absolutely nothing. Then he said, "Get some sleep," and left the room. And she listened to his footsteps in the hall and thought, he knows something has changed. He doesn't know what yet, but he feels it. She had maybe 48 hours before he figured out what. The call from Margot came the next morning at 7:52. Nyla was already dressed, already on cellular data, already sitting in the garden where no interior camera could capture her screen. "There's a problem," Margot said, and her voice had the specific quality of controlled urgency that Nyla had learned to read over the past 2 weeks. Margot kept control the way certain structures keep their shape under pressure, right up until the moment they don't. The federal team came back this morning with a modification to the scope agreement, a significant one. Nyla's hand tightened on the phone. "What kind of modification?" "They want your testimony to include the financial authorization process from the beginning of the marriage. All of it, not just the signing conditions. They want you to walk them through every instance where documentation bearing your name was presented to you, every interaction you had with Castell's legal team, every communication." That's far beyond what we agreed." "Yes." A pause. "The reason they've expanded the request is because something changed in their case. A witness they were relying on has recanted. A key testimony about the internal authorization chain has been withdrawn, and they need to rebuild that section of their evidentiary framework from a different angle. Your comprehensive account would help them do that." Nyla stood up from the garden bench. She walked to the far end of the garden near the old stone wall and stood there because she needed something solid behind her. "What does this mean for my protections, for the property clause challenges?" A longer pause. The kind that means the answer is complicated in a way the other person wishes it weren't. The scope of protection in the agreement was sized to the scope of cooperation. If the scope of cooperation expands, the protections can expand proportionally. But the property clause challenge, that's a civil proceeding that exists independently of the federal agreement. What changes is the leverage. More comprehensive cooperation means stronger positioning in that proceeding, but it also means more exposure during the process. More time with your name active in this case. More time for Damien to understand what I'm doing. "Yes." She pressed her free hand against the stone wall. The surface was cold and rough and real. She focused on the texture of it. What happens if I hold the original scope? If I say no to the expansion? Then the federal team proceeds without your comprehensive account. Your cooperation is limited to what we originally defined, and your protections are limited to the same. The property clause challenge proceeds, but without the additional leverage. And Nyla, Margot paused again, and this pause had weight in it, the weight of something the attorney had been deciding whether to say. Cole told me something off the record this morning. The witness who recanted, the recantation happened 40 hours ago, the same window as Rosa's accident. The garden went very quiet, or Nyla went very quiet inside the garden. The birds were still moving in the hedgerow. The groundskeeper's equipment was running somewhere on the east side. The world was conducting itself with complete indifference. But inside Nyla's skull, everything had gone to a specific cold silence. "He's cleaning the board," she said. "That's Cole's read, yes." Which means he already knows there's an active investigation. He's known for some time, we think. He's been managing it. The recantation suggests someone in his organization has access to information about the federal case's internal structure, which is a significant problem for Cole's team, and separately, a significant problem for you, because it means if Damien becomes aware of your cooperation, the information could move back through the same channel. Nyla stood at the stone wall in her garden on a cool morning and looked at the sky and understood, with the total clarity of a person who has just had the last available illusion removed, what she was actually inside. She was not a woman navigating a divorce. She was a person standing in the middle of an active war between a criminal financial organization and a federal investigation, with her name on documents for both sides, with no walls and no cover and no one who could extract her from this without her walking through the center of it herself. "Tell Cole yes," she said. "Nyla, tell him yes to the expanded scope. I want the strongest possible protections in writing before I say one word on record. And I want a provision. I want it explicit, in the language, not implied, that if any attempt is made to obstruct, intimidate, or harm me or any person connected to me during the cooperation period, the federal team is obligated to respond. I want Rosa's name in there. I want Elias Carter's name in there." A silence. Then, "That's a strong ask." "It should be. I'm about to hand them everything they need to finish their case." A pause. "And Margot, I need the new agreement signed before I go back inside that house tonight." She ended the call. She stood at the wall. She turned around and looked at Raven Hill. The beautiful, cold, curated facade of it, the perfectly maintained gardens, the iron gate with the brass plaque, all of it representing 12 years of Damien Castell's careful construction of a life designed to be untouchable. She thought, "You used me to build this. My name, my silence, my 6 years of staying small and asking nothing. You used all of it." She thought, "I'm going to walk back into that house right now and I'm going to sit at that dinner table tonight and I'm going to look at you across all that empty space between us, and you are not going to know that I have just agreed to take apart everything you built." She walked back toward the house. The afternoon was the longest of her life. She moved through it with the mechanical precision of a person operating on the part of the brain that functions after the emotional center has gone temporarily offline. She answered emails about the household management ones, the mundane logistics of a large property. She called the hospital to check on Rosa and was told Rosa was resting and couldn't take calls yet. She stood in the kitchen and made herself eat half a sandwich because Margot had told her weeks ago, practical as weather, that she needed to maintain basic function and nutrition was part of basic function. At 4:15, something happened that she had not planned for. She was passing through the main corridor when she heard Damien's voice from his study. The door was 3 inches ajar, which was unusual in itself, and his voice was in the register she now recognized as controlled urgency, the low, flat tone of a man managing something that has stopped being manageable. She did not slow down. She kept walking at precisely her normal pace, but she was close enough, for the 3 seconds she was adjacent to that door, to hear 2 things with total clarity. The first was Damien's voice saying, "Find out who she's been meeting with." The second, 2 seconds later, was her own name. She made it to the end of the corridor. She went into the small sitting room and she stood behind the door and she pressed her back against the wall and she breathed in and out, the controlled breathing she'd been practicing since the cab ride to Margot's first appointment, and she thought, there it is. He knew. Not the specifics, not Margot's name, not the federal agreement, not yet. But he knew she had been somewhere doing something, and he had finally decided that the wife who never asked questions had begun asking them, and now he was doing what Damien Castell did with problems. He was deploying resources to understand it so he could contain it. She had hours, maybe less. She pulled out her phone and texted Margot one word: tonight. Margot responded in 4 minutes with an address. Not her office, a different location, a place that wouldn't appear on any record connected to Nyla's established patterns, and then a second message. Document is ready. Bring ID. Nyla put the phone in her pocket. She stood in the small sitting room and she looked at the painting on the wall, an abstract landscape that Damien had chosen, that she had lived with for 6 years and never loved, and she thought about what came next. Going to sign the agreement meant leaving the estate tonight without triggering whatever surveillance Damien had just set in motion. It meant getting out of Raven Hill in the next few hours in a way that looked ordinary enough to not immediately raise an alarm. It meant being physically outside the gate and in a cab before anyone with Damien's resources had time to understand what was happening. And when she came back, because she would come back, because running would destroy her civil case and hand him the narrative, she would be walking into a house where the man she was legally married to had just ordered someone to find out who she'd been meeting with, and she would have to look him in the face across dinner or in the corridor or wherever their paths crossed next, and she would have to be exactly who she had always been to him. Invisible. Quiet. Not a problem. For the last time. Because after tonight, after her signature was on that expanded agreement, and Warren Cole's protection provisions were in writing, and Margot had filed the initiating documents for the property clause challenge, Nyla Brooks Castell was going to stop performing. She was going to stop being the woman built for this house. She was going to become something Damien had never once considered she could be. A threat. She smoothed her shirt. She opened the sitting room door. She walked back down the corridor toward the stairs at exactly her normal pace. And when she passed the study, the door was still 3 inches ajar, and she did not look at it. And she went upstairs and she picked up her bag and her coat and her phone, and she came back downstairs and she told the one staff member she encountered, the evening housekeeper, a young woman named Petra, who had been there 8 months and kept her head down, that she was going out for some air and would be back by 9. Petra nodded without particular interest. This was the beauty of years of invisible routine. Nobody watched the woman who had never been worth watching. Nyla walked out the side door, across the garden, and through the secondary gate on the west side of the property that opened onto a residential street 2 blocks from a main road where cabs ran continuously. The evening air hit her face. She kept walking. And behind her, in the lit windows of Raven Hill, a man who had spent 6 years managing every variable of a carefully constructed world had no idea that the one variable he had never bothered to manage had just walked out the door and was not coming back as the woman she had been when she walked in. But she was coming back as something else entirely, and what she carried in her coat pocket, Margot's address, the agreement waiting for her signature, the names of the people she had just placed under federal protection, was heavier than anything she had ever carried inside that house. Heavier, and for the first time in 6 years, entirely, completely hers. She reached the main road. She raised her hand. A cab pulled over. She got in. She said the address clearly, without hesitation, the way you speak when you have finally decided that your own voice is worth the air it takes to use it. And the cab pulled into traffic, and the lights of the city opened up around her, and somewhere in the federal building across town, Warren Cole's phone was about to ring with a message from Margot Hines that would tell him the last piece of his case had just decided to stop being afraid. She signed the agreement at 10 minutes past 8 in a conference room above a dry cleaning business on Aldrich Street that Margot used as a secondary meeting space precisely because it appeared on no professional registry connected to her name. The room smelled like old coffee and carpet cleaner, and Nyla sat at a folding table under fluorescent light and read every page of the expanded cooperation agreement herself, slowly, without apology for the time it took, while Margot sat across from her and Warren Cole stood near the window with his hands in his pockets, and the particular patience of a man who has learned that rushing people through the most important documents of their lives produces bad testimony and worse outcomes. She read all 31 pages. She asked 4 questions. Margot answered 3 of them, and Cole answered the 4th, which was about the specific trigger conditions for the protection provision. What exactly constituted an actionable threat against herself or the named individuals, and what the federal response timeline looked like. Cole's answer was precise and not entirely comforting. The provision was real. The response was not instantaneous. There was a gap between threat and response that existed because the law existed in real time and not in the abstract. And in that gap, a person was responsible for her own immediate safety. "I understand," Nyla said. She signed. Her handwriting was steady. She noticed it being steady and filed that away somewhere. That her hand did not shake when she signed this document the way it had probably shaken, young and uninformed and pressured by proximity to her father's need, when she had signed the one 6 years ago. Different woman, different hand. Cole took his copy. Margot kept hers. Nyla folded her copy into her bag. "First recorded interview is Monday," Cole said. "We'll contact Margot with location, not a federal building. Somewhere neutral." Nyla nodded. She stood. She picked up her bag and her coat, and she looked at Warren Cole and she said, "The witness who recanted, is she safe?" Cole held her gaze for a moment. "We're managing it." "That's not what I asked." A pause. "We're doing what we can," he said. And that was the most honest thing he'd said in the room, and they both knew it, and Nyla nodded and walked out. The cab back to Raven Hill took 14 minutes. She spent them constructing the face she needed to wear when she walked back through that door. Not performance exactly, more like retrieval, going back into the storage where she'd kept the version of herself that moved through this house without disturbing anything. The woman who took up no atmospheric space, who answered in half sentences and looked at the middle distance and gave Damien Castell nothing worth cataloging. She needed that woman for a few more days. She walked in at 8:53. Petra was still in the kitchen. Damien's study light was on. She went upstairs, changed out of her coat, washed her face with cold water, and looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a long moment. She went to bed. She did not sleep. At 2:47 in the morning, her phone vibrated on the nightstand. The screen showed a number she didn't recognize. She almost let it go to voicemail. Some register of instinct that had been developing for weeks, sharpening itself against fear the way a blade sharpens against stone, made her answer. "Mrs. Castell." A woman's voice. Low, clipped, not friendly. "My name is Diana Reeves. I was the witness who recanted." Nyla sat up. The room was dark. Her heartbeat had moved into a higher gear without any preparatory escalation. Just instantly, efficiently fast. "How did you get this number?" "Elias Carter. He said you could be trusted. I have about 10 minutes before I need to move, so I'm going to be direct. I recanted because 2 men came to my apartment and explained to me what would happen to my sister's family in Phoenix if I didn't. That's the real reason. I've already communicated it to Cole's team, but I needed you to hear it directly because there's something Cole doesn't know yet." A pause. Short. Functional. "The documents your name is on. There are more than 47. There are 93. The additional 46 were filed through a subsidiary called Aldrich Meridian in the 18 months before your 7th anniversary. They were designed to be discovered only after the anniversary date passed, at which point the asset protections in your contract would have fully vested and any challenge would have become significantly harder. Your husband was not just using your name as historic cover, he was actively extending it. Present tense, not past. Nyla's hand on the phone was not shaking, but it felt different than it had at the signing table. She was aware of it in a way she usually wasn't, aware of her own grip, the pressure of her fingers against the case. "Does Cole know about Aldrich Meridian?" "He knows the name. He doesn't have the filings yet. I have copies. I was going to provide them as part of my testimony before the recantation. I still have them, but I can't be the one to deliver them now, not with my sister's family in play." Another short pause. "I'm sorry. I know what I'm asking. You're asking me to get them to Cole. I'm asking you to be the one who finishes this, because you're the only person in this with enough legal cover to survive doing it." The line went dead. Nyla sat in the dark of her bedroom in Raven Hill with her phone in her hand in the specific silence of a house that is both a home and a trap. And she thought about 93 documents, and she thought about Aldrich Meridian, and she thought about the 18th month before the 7th anniversary, which was 4 months from now, which meant the clock was not where she thought it was. The clock was closer. The architecture of what had been built around her was more recent and more deliberate than she had understood. And the man sleeping somewhere in this same building had not merely used her in the past, but was actively using her right now. In the present tense, his planning extending forward into a future he had mapped out without her knowledge or consent. She got out of bed. She got dressed in the dark. She was not going back to sleep. She sat at her desk and wrote, by hand, on paper, everything Diana Reeves had told her, in as much detail as she could reconstruct. Names, numbers, the timeline. She wrote it twice. One copy she folded and put in her coat pocket. One copy she put between the pages of the second book on her third shelf. A history of garden design that no one in this house had ever touched or would touch. At 5:15, she heard Damien's door. Footsteps. The sound of him moving through his morning shower, the particular weight of his walk, the sounds of a person who occupies space with absolute certainty that the space belongs to him. She sat at her desk and listened to the sounds of his morning and worked to keep her breathing regular. At 6:40, he knocked on her door. She said, "Come in." He was dressed, fully, early, with the kind of deliberateness that meant this was not a casual check-in. He stood in the doorway and looked at her at the desk, still dressed, and something moved through his expression at the sight of her already up. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," she said. He looked at her for a moment that was 3 seconds longer than it needed to be. "I'd like to talk, if you have time before I leave." "Talk about what?" He came into the room. Not all the way. He stopped near the foot of the bed, maintaining the physical distance that had characterized their entire marriage. But his presence in this room was unusual enough that her body registered it as a change in environmental conditions. Her pulse ticked upward. She kept her face even. "I know you've been going out," he said, "more than usual." "I've been going out," she said. "I didn't realize that required reporting." "It doesn't." His jaw moved. That's not what this is." "Then what is it?" He looked at her with the full weight of his attention, which was something she had spent years wishing for and now experienced as a form of pressure. The specific pressure of being truly seen by someone who has a stake in what they find. "Something is different," he said. "With you, over the past few weeks. I want to know if you're all right." The presumption of it, "I want to know if you're all right," delivered by a man who had not asked that question once in 6 years, delivered now precisely because her difference threatened him, rather than because her well-being concerned him, moved through Nyla with a heat that she contained only by the application of every skill she had developed in 2 weeks of learning to be functional while managing an interior catastrophe. "I'm fine," she said. "Nyla? Damien." She looked at him directly. "If you have a specific question, ask it. Otherwise, I have things to do this morning." The silence between them had a new quality. Not the old silence of mutual avoidance, but something with edges, something that both of them could feel the shape of. He looked at her, and she looked back, and she gave him nothing, and she watched him make the calculation that powerful men make when a situation has become uncertain. How much to press? How much to wait? Which risk is larger? He chose to wait. "We'll talk later," he said. "Sure," she said. He left. She listened to his footsteps all the way down the stairs and out the front door, and the sound of the car and the gate. Then she picked up her phone and called Margot. "Margot, I need an emergency meeting with Cole. Today. Not Monday. Today." She relayed Diana Reeves's information in compressed, precise language. No emotion, just the shape of the facts. 93 documents. Aldrich Meridian. Active, not historic. He's still building the structure, and my anniversary date is the deadline. Margot was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "I'll call Cole now. Where can you be at noon?" "Anywhere that isn't here." "Noon, same address as last night." Nyla hung up. She stood in her room and she looked at the door Damien had just walked out of, and she thought, later. He said, "We'll talk later." And she thought about what later looked like, what the conversation looked like when he had had enough time to consolidate whatever intelligence his people had gathered about her movements. She thought about how much time she had before later became now, before the careful suspension of the past 2 weeks collapsed into direct confrontation. She thought, maybe I should not wait for him to choose the moment. Maybe the only move left is to be the one who chooses it. She held that thought. She turned it over. It was terrifying in the specific way of thoughts that are also correct. Noon came. She sat across from Warren Cole in the same folding table room on Aldrich Street, and she laid out Diana Reeves's information with the methodical clarity of a woman who has been awake for 30 hours and has moved past the state where exhaustion produces confusion into the state where it produces a strange crystalline focus, everything non-essential stripped away, only the structure of what matters remaining. Cole listened without interrupting. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment and then looked at the legal pad where he'd been writing and then back at her. Aldrich Meridian, he said. You know it. We flagged it 8 months ago as a potential shell entity. We couldn't establish the filing chain. He paused. If Diana Reeves has the actual documents, she can't deliver them directly. She explained why. Which means we need another access point. He tapped his pen once against the pad. Mrs. Castell, the additional 46 filings, is there any possibility of documentation being physically accessible within the Castell estate? Records? Hard copies? Anything in Castell's personal files? The air in the room changed, or Nyla's relationship to the air changed. She thought about the study on the second floor, the door she was never asked to enter, the voices she had heard through it. I don't have access to his private files, she said carefully, but you live in the estate. Yes. Cole looked at her and she looked back, and they both understood what was happening in the space between those two statements without either of them saying it, because Cole was careful and Margot was in the room, and what Cole was not going to do was ask a civilian cooperation witness to access private documents in her own home, because that was the kind of thing that contaminated evidence and ended prosecutions, and they all understood this, and Cole put his pen down and said, I want to be clear that I am not asking you to do anything beyond the scope of the cooperation agreement. I know, Nyla said, and I want to be clear that anything obtained outside of legally authorized channels would be problematic for our case. I understand that too. A pause. What I can tell you, Cole said, is that we are in a position to move for expanded access to Castell Holdings records through standard legal channels within 48 to 72 hours, and that if anything material to our case were to become accessible through other means during that window. He stopped. He looked at the table. I'm not finishing that sentence. No, Nyla said. You're not. She went home. She stood outside the gate of Ravenhill at 2 in the afternoon on a day that had started at 2:47 in the morning with a phone call from a frightened woman and had moved through signing tables and emergency meetings and the controlled vocabulary of federal law enforcement, and she looked at the house and she made a decision that was not in any agreement she had signed and was not something Margot would advise and was not something the rational, measured, careful version of herself would do. She was going into that study. Not to steal, not to remove. She understood the evidentiary issues, had processed Cole's careful non-sentence with total comprehension. But she could look. She could look and remember, and what she saw and remembered was in her own mind, which was hers, which no one could contaminate. She went in through the side entrance. Petra wasn't there. The afternoon staff had a rotation gap between 2 and 4 that she had observed and never mentioned, and was now grateful for in a way that felt almost like the practical love of small noticed things. She went upstairs. She went down the corridor she had never belonged in. The study door was closed, but not locked. Damien had not locked it because he had never had reason to consider that she might enter. This was both the consequence and the symbol of 6 years of being treated as furniture. She had become invisible enough that she was not a threat worth locking a door against. She opened it. The study was large and dark-paneled and smelled like him. The specific cold, clean scent of a man who keeps his environment controlled. 2 walls of shelving. A desk that was clear except for a single laptop and a desk lamp. filing cabinets along the right wall, locked, which she had expected. A credenza behind the desk with a series of labeled binders. The labels were a Castell Holdings internal filing system she didn't fully understand, but she could read the alphanumeric codes and she scanned them quickly, her eyes moving along the labels with the focused efficiency of a woman who has spent the last 3 weeks developing skills she never wanted to need. There, a binder labeled AM 2 through AM 7. 6 binders. AM. Aldrich Meridian. She did not touch them. She stood in the center of the room, and she looked and she read the external labels, and she pressed every visible detail into memory with the desperate concentration of a person who understands that this moment is finite and unrepeatable and contains information that will matter. She had been in the room for 4 minutes when she heard the front door. Her blood went cold. Not metaphorically, she felt the actual temperature shift, a physical response that moved from her sternum outward to her hands. And she was moving before she had consciously decided to move, back across the room, through the doorway, pulling the door to exactly the position she had found it in, 3 inches precise. She was 12 feet down the corridor, walking at exactly her normal pace when she heard his footsteps on the stairs. Damien came up and saw her in the corridor and stopped. They were 15 feet apart. The afternoon light came through the window at the corridor's end and fell between them. He looked at her. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something that she was going to have to deal with later. A full percussion section, all of it happening behind her ribs in a space that felt suddenly insufficient. "You're home early," she said. His eyes moved to the study door at the end of the corridor, then back to her. The calculation happening behind his face was visible to her now in a way it hadn't been 6 weeks ago. She had learned to read him in the way that people learn to read the things that are trying to harm them. "Marcus called," he said. "Something came up." His voice was even. "What are you doing in this wing?" "Looking for the linen closet," she said. "Petra moved some things around. I think she reorganized the upstairs storage." A beat. His eyes moved to the study door again, measuring the distance between it and her, doing the math of hallway geography. "The linen closet is the other direction," he said. "I know," she said. "I got turned around." 7 seconds of silence, her pulse in her throat, her jaw, her temples, everywhere at once. Then Damien said, very quietly, "We need to talk tonight, not later, tonight, after dinner." It wasn't a request. "All right," she said. She walked past him in the corridor. She kept her pace exactly even. She did not look back. She went down the stairs and through the main room, and she went to the kitchen, and she poured a glass of water, and she drank all of it in one slow, deliberate act of making herself stay in her own body, stay in the room, stay in the moment, instead of flying apart into the fear of what came next. Tonight, after dinner. She set the glass down. She looked at the kitchen window, at the garden beyond it, at the stone wall at the far end where she had stood with her hand pressed against the cold, rough surface on the morning she'd decided to stop being afraid. She thought, "All right then, tonight." She thought, "I am not the woman who looked at that sapphire dress for 4 months before she wore it." She thought, "I have signed a federal cooperation agreement. I have read 93 documents in my mind. I have Rosa's injury and a recanted witness, and a woman in hiding, and a study full of binders with my future in them, and I am standing in my own kitchen in a house that was never a home. And tonight is tonight, and I am going to walk into whatever room Damien Castell chooses for this conversation, and I am not going to lower my eyes." The afternoon moved. She cooked, because no one else was there to cook, and because the physical act of making food required her hands, and her hands needed something to do. She made pasta, simple and mechanical, boiling water, the steam rising in the cool kitchen, and she thought about what she knew and organized it into the order she would need it in, the way you lay out equipment before a procedure. This first, then this, then this. Damien came to the kitchen at 7. He sat at the kitchen table without being invited, which he had never done in 6 years, and she put pasta in a bowl and set it in front of him and sat across from him, and they ate in the particular silence of 2 people who are not pretending anymore. She waited. She had decided to let him open it. She wanted to see what he chose to lead with, what he thought she knew, what he was trying to contain, Where in the architecture of his careful control the fracture had appeared? He ate half his food. He set his fork down. He looked at her. "I know you've been meeting with an attorney," he said. The sentence landed clean and flat in the room between them. No introduction, no cushion. She looked back at him. "Yes," she said. Something moved across his face, not anger, not yet. More like a man who has confirmed a diagnosis he was hoping to be wrong about. "For how long?" "A few weeks." "About the contract." "Among other things." He was quiet for a moment. His hands on the table were still, which she knew by now was not a sign of calm but of extreme control. Damien Castell's stillness was always the product of effort. "Nyla, whatever you think you've found, I don't think," she said. "I know." He looked at her, and something in the look shifted, and she felt, for the first time in this house, genuinely afraid not of what he might do, but of what she was about to do. Because she had decided in the kitchen with the pasta water boiling that she was not going to be the woman who waited for the right moment anymore. "I know about the property clause," she said. "I know what my signature was used for. I know about the authorization breadth. I know about Aldrich Meridian." She watched his face as each name landed. "I know you were still filing documents 18 months ago. I know the 7th anniversary was a structural deadline, not a sentimental one." A pause. She held his gaze completely. "And I know you had someone looking into who I've been meeting with." The kitchen was silent. Damien sat across from her with the particular quality of a man in the exact moment when a structure he has spent years building reveals that it cannot hold. Not collapsed yet, not quite, but the sound before the collapse, the specific groan of load-bearing things under more weight than they were built to carry. "How?" he said. Just that. Flat and direct and stripped of everything except the genuine need to understand. "Does it matter?" Yes. His voice had changed. The controlled warmth, the social precision, it was gone. And what was underneath was harder and more honest than anything she had heard from him in 6 years. "It matters to me." "Why? Because you need to know which part of the wall has the crack?" "Because I need to know how much—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "How much you actually know." She looked at him across the table in the kitchen of the house that had her mother's house in a legal vice, in the house that had her name on 93 documents she'd never read, in the house she had lived in for 6 years, being managed and erased and deployed as a legal instrument by the man sitting across from her right now. And she felt something arrive in her chest that was not rage and not grief, but something that contained both of them and was larger than either. "Everything," she said. "I know everything, Damien." And she watched him understand that the variable he had never managed was now the only thing in the room that mattered. And she held his gaze without looking away. And the kitchen clock marked the seconds between them like a thing that could not be stopped. The kitchen clock kept marking seconds. Damien sat across from her, and the look on his face was something she had never seen there before. Not in 6 years of meals not eaten together, not in corridors passed through without acknowledgement, not in the car rides to events where he had deployed her and then forgotten her. What was on his face now was not the controlled calculation of a man managing risk. It was something rawer and less practiced than that. It was the specific expression of a man who has just understood that the ground he was standing on has been, for some time, not ground at all. "Everything," he repeated. Not a challenge, almost a question. "Sit down," she said, and he was already sitting, had been sitting, but the instruction was about something else, and they both understood what. She was telling him to stop managing this, to stop scanning for the exit, to stay in the room with what was actually happening. He stayed. She told him. Not everything, not the federal specifics, not the agreement or Cole's name or the cooperation provisions. Margot had been clear about what she could and couldn't disclose, and she stayed within those lines with the precision of a woman who has learned the hard way that lines exist for reasons. But she told him what she knew about her own contract, the property clause, the authorization breadth, the way her signature had been used as structural cover for years of financial activity she had never been permitted to understand. She told him about the seventh anniversary clause and what it meant and what it had been designed to ensure. She told him she had not read the contract 6 years ago, and she knew why she hadn't, and she was not asking him to confirm it. She was telling him that she knew. She spoke in a level voice. She did not raise it. She did not cry, though somewhere behind her sternum there was a pressure that was doing something adjacent to crying, a kind of sustained internal force that she was containing through the application of everything she had become in the past month. She spoke the way a person speaks when they have been through the fire of their own fear and come out the other side into a country where clarity is the only available currency. Damien listened. He did not interrupt. He did not perform innocence or manufacture outrage. He sat with his hands on the table and he listened to his wife speak the exact shape of what had been done to her, and his face moved through things she watched and could not fully name, some compound of guilt and grief and the particular shame of a person confronting not cruelty they intended but damage they permitted, which is its own category of failure and in some ways harder to sit with because it cannot be defended by the clarity of malice. When she finished, the kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the evening garden sat in its darkness. The groundskeeper had long since gone home. The lights along the stone wall made small cold pools on the grass. Damien looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "The contract was Marcus's structure. The authorization clause, I knew what it did. I signed off on including it." A pause. "I told myself it was standard protection for the organization, that it wasn't, that you wouldn't be harmed by it unless—" He stopped. "Unless I tried to leave," she said. He looked up. "Yes." "Which you assumed I wouldn't do." He didn't answer that. The answer was in the silence, in the 6 years of infrastructure built on the assumption that she would stay, not because she chose to, but because the contract made leaving too costly. He had not thought of it as a cage. She suspected he had not let himself think of it as a cage. But the bars were the bars regardless of what you called them when you were installing them. "The Aldrich Meridian filings," she said. "The ones from the past 18 months. Something moved across his face. The confirmation reflex of a person who was not expecting that name from her mouth. "I know they exist," she said. "I know what they were designed to do." He was quiet for a moment. "How?" "That's not something I'm going to tell you." Another silence. His jaw worked. When he looked at her again, his face had something in it that was different from anything she'd seen there all evening. Something stripped and tired and honest in the way that men are sometimes honest when they have run out of the energy required to be otherwise. "I didn't intend—" He stopped again, started over. "When this began 6 years ago, I believed that distance was a form of protection, that if I kept you removed from the organization's operations, from the people involved, you would be safer. The emotional distance was—" He pressed his lips together. "I told myself it was strategic. For you." Nyla looked at him for a long moment. She felt the pull of the sentence, the possibility inside it, the version of events where distance was not contempt but a misshapen form of care. She felt the pull, and she recognized it, and she did not let it move her, because she had spent too long being moved by what she needed to believe to survive. "Maybe that's true," she said. "Maybe some part of you believed that." She held his gaze. "But you also sat in that car 2 days ago and told someone to find out who I'd been meeting with. You said, in your own study, that I never asked questions, like that was a quality that made me useful." A pause. "You can't have both of those things, Damien. You can't tell me the distance was to protect me and also have spent 6 years relying on my silence to protect yourself." He had no answer for that. There was no answer. She hadn't expected one. She had said it not to wound him, but because it was true. And because she had come to understand in the past weeks that true things needed to be spoken aloud in order to stop functioning as the walls of the room you were trapped in. He sat there. He looked like a man who had been stripped of the architecture of himself and had not yet found out what was underneath. "What happens now?" he said. "Now," she said, "I'm going to protect myself. Fully. Legally. Whatever that requires." She paused. "And you're going to have to find out what you are when someone isn't building your walls for you." She pushed back her chair. She stood. She carried her bowl to the sink and she rinsed it, the sound of the water loud in the quiet kitchen. And she set it in the drying rack and she dried her hands on the kitchen towel. And she did all of this with total deliberateness because she was aware that this was one of the last times she would stand in this kitchen and she wanted to be in it rather than past it. She walked out without looking back. She did not sleep. She packed instead. Not everything, only the things that were actually hers, a distinction she had never had to make consciously before, but now made with the precision of a woman who has thought carefully about what belongs to her and what she has merely been storing. Clothes she had bought herself. Books. Her mother's photograph, a single frame picture from a summer 20 years ago. Her mother standing in the garden on Callaway Street with dirt on her hands and her head thrown back, laughing at something the camera couldn't see. A journal she had kept in the first year of the marriage and abandoned and recently retrieved and continued. The pearl earrings she had worn to the Belmont Gala. She left at 5:48 in the morning. Dawn was beginning at the edges of the sky, not warm yet, just the pale suggestion of it, light without color. She did not take the estate's car. She called a cab from her phone and carried her 2 bags to the secondary gate on the west side and waited. And the cab came, and she got in, and she did not look back at Ravenhill as the car pulled away. She had thought she might. She had thought there might be some pull of the 6 years. The garden she had planted, the mornings she had survived, the specific quality of light through the kitchen window in early autumn. There was something, but it was small, and it was not regret. It was more like the feeling of setting down a weight and being briefly aware of the shape of the absence. She went to Elias's. He was already awake, coffee made, when she knocked, and he opened the door and looked at her with her 2 bags and her morning face and said nothing except, "You eat yet?" And she said no, and he made eggs, and they sat at his kitchen table in the early morning and ate, and she told him the compressed version of the night, and he listened the way he always listened, and when she was done, he said, "What do you need now?" "A few days," she said, "and then I need to give a very long recorded testimony." The federal cooperation process took 4 months. It was not the 4 months she might have imagined in the abstract, not dramatic, not cinematic, not punctuated by revelations. It was mostly rooms, conference rooms and legal offices, and the specific quality of institutional fluorescent light that makes every human face look slightly diminished. It was questions and questions about the answers and documentation, and Margot's hand on her arm in hallways outside rooms where difficult things had been established on the record. It was the slow, methodical work of dismantling a structure piece by piece, the way demolition actually works. Not explosive, but cumulative, each removed element revealing the dependencies of the ones around it. She told the truth. All of it, within the scope of what she actually knew, without embellishment and without strategic omission. She described every document she had signed and the conditions under which she had signed it. She described the absence of independent counsel. She described the specific language her father had used when he presented the contract. Standard, this is all standard. And she described the 6 years of managed isolation that had kept her from understanding what she had signed. She described it all in the precise, organized language of a woman who had spent a month preparing to speak, and she did not perform a motion for the investigators because the truth required none. Warren Cole's team used her account to rebuild the authorization chain that Diana Reeves's recantation had broken. The Aldrich Meridian binders were obtained through a formal search warrant executed 11 days after she left Ravenhill. The 46 additional filings were exactly where she had seen them in her mind, labeled AM2 through AM7, in the study she had stood in for 4 minutes on an afternoon that now felt like it belonged to a different woman's life. The case moved. Federal cases move slowly and then all at once, like water behind a dam that holds and then doesn't. Marcus Fell's cooperation with investigators came first, a man who had built the legal structure of an empire discovering, at the moment the empire began to crack, that his own name was deep in the architecture. 2 other senior members of the Castell holding structure followed within 6 weeks. The financial network unwound the way it had been built, quietly, systematically, with the particular efficiency of people motivated by their own survival. Damien voluntarily engaged with federal authorities in the 3rd month. Margot told her about it in their weekly call, neutrally, as information. Nyla sat with it for a day before she understood what she actually felt, which was not satisfaction and not vindication and not grief, but something more complicated than any of those, something like the specific emotion that has no clean name, the feeling of having spent years in relationship with a force that defined your life, and then watching that force submit to something larger than itself. She had not done this to him. She had not wanted to destroy him. She had wanted to get free, and freedom sometimes, in a life like the one she had been living, looks from a distance like destruction. She visited Rosa in the rehabilitation center 6 weeks after the hip surgery. Rosa was in a room with afternoon light coming through beige curtains and a television playing quietly in the corner. And when Nyla came in, she saw Rosa's face do something that Nyla had to look away from briefly because it was too direct, too much unmediated feeling for a woman who had spent months managing her own. Rosa took her hand when she sat down. She held it for a long moment without speaking. "I didn't think you'd come," Rosa said. "Why not?" "I thought maybe you'd be too busy leaving." "I came back," Nyla said. Rosa looked at her steadily. The same reading the weather look, but more open now, stripped of the professional caution of an employee navigating a complicated household. "How much trouble?" "Less than there was," Nyla said. "More than I expected it to cost." Rosa patted her hand once. "Everything costs," she said. "The question is whether you get something worth what you paid." Nyla looked at her. "Was it you? The night of the board dinner? Did you tell someone I'd been going out?" Rosa was quiet for a moment. Not guilty quiet, considering quiet, the silence of a woman deciding how honest to be. "Someone asked me questions," she said finally. "About your schedule, about who you'd been seeing." A pause. "I told them you were a grown woman, and I didn't monitor grown women. But they kept asking. For a few days, yes." She paused again. "I think that's why I fell." The sentence sat between them. Nyla kept her face even. She had suspected this for months, and the confirmation landed not as shock, but as a weight she had already been carrying, which she adjusted for. "Are you safe now?" she asked. "I'm in a hospital bed with a metal hip," Rosa said. "I feel very safe." The dry humor of a woman who has survived enough that she can afford it. Nyla squeezed her hand. "When you're done here, if you want work, I'm going to have something different." Rosa raised an eyebrow. "I'm not going to run a house," Nyla said. "I'm going to run a place." The civil case regarding the property clause took 5 months, not the year Margot had initially projected. The expanded federal cooperation and the documented record of coercive contract conditions without independent counsel provided exactly the leverage Margot had said they would. Damien's legal team did not contest aggressively, which Margot interpreted as the consequence of a man managing too many simultaneous legal pressures to open another front, and which Nyla interpreted as something she didn't want to examine too closely because she was not going to spend her life trying to understand Damien Castell's motivations. The house on Calloway Street was returned to her name, free and clear, in the 5th month. Margot called her on a Tuesday morning with the news. Nyla was sitting in a coffee shop 2 blocks from Elias's apartment. She had found her own place the month before, a rental, small and entirely hers. And she listened to the words, and she felt something happen in her chest that was big enough that she had to press her hand flat against the table to stay in her body, to stay in the room, to not fly apart into whatever the feeling was. She said, "Thank you, Margot." She hung up and she sat in the coffee shop, and she looked at her hand on the table. And after a while, the coffee shop continued around her, and the feeling settled into something she could carry. And she picked up her cup and finished her coffee, and then she went and bought flowers. Not a specific kind, just what was vivid, yellow and orange, and one branch of something deep red. And she took them to Calloway Street. The house had been empty for 4 years, and it showed. The garden her mother had tended for 3 decades had gone unmaintained, overgrown in the particular melancholy way of things that were once loved, and then left. The front steps needed repair, 2 windows needed resealing. The paint on the porch railing was lifting. Nyla stood in front of it with her flowers, and she looked at all of it, the damage and the bones under the damage, the shape of the house that her mother had made into a place of warmth, the remains of the garden, the potential of the whole thing, and she felt grief, and something that was not its opposite but could exist alongside it. She went inside. She opened windows. She set the flowers in a water glass because there were no vases and put them on the kitchen counter, and she stood in her mother's kitchen and breathed the air of it, which smelled like old house and possibility, and she began making a list. She hired the contractors in the month that followed. She applied for the permits. She engaged with a nonprofit development consultant that Elias connected her with. She had some money. She had never had access to Castell wealth, but she had her own prior savings, carefully kept in an account that predated the marriage, and she had received a settlement allocation through the civil case that Margot had negotiated with a precision that Nyla was grateful for without wanting to examine the details of too closely. She rebuilt Calloway Street over 7 months. Not just the house, the structure she had described to Rosa in the rehabilitation center. A community center, small, concrete, real. 3 meeting rooms and a kitchen and a garden in the back that she planted herself over a series of weekends in early spring, kneeling in the soil that her mother had worked for decades and working it again, hands in the dirt, learning the patience that growing things require. The center opened on a Thursday in April. Rosa was there, walking with a cane and refusing assistance and wearing a yellow dress she had bought for the occasion. Elias was there, standing near the back with his coffee and his unhurried way of occupying space. Margot Hines was there. She had declined the invitation twice and then appeared anyway, standing near the door with her reading glasses pushed up on her head. Dr. Carmen Reyes from the Belmont Gala was there, who had stayed in contact after the gala and had provided connections and advice during the months of rebuilding with the matter-of-fact generosity of a person who gives because it costs them nothing they can't spare. Gerald Ashworth was there. 12 young women from the surrounding neighborhood were there, ranging in age from 16 to 24, who had come because of the flyer that Nyla had posted at the community board and the library and the church steps without going inside. The flyer had been simple, a place for women who have been told to be smaller. Come as you are. Nyla stood in the front room and looked at the people in it and felt the specific weight of what it had cost to get here. The 6 years and the contract and the 4 months of federal interviews and the 5 months of civil proceedings and Rosa's fractured hip and Diana Reeves in hiding and the sapphire dress and the night she'd stood in Damien's study and pressed every detail of those binders into her memory. All of it. The complete cost, the total weight of the past 7 years brought to this room, this afternoon, this Thursday in April, with yellow flowers on every table and her mother's garden beginning to bloom in the back. She said a few words. She didn't write them out in advance. She said, "This place is for anyone who has been managed down to nothing and has decided that's finished." She said, "We're not going to fix you here because you're not broken." She said, "We're going to remember together what we already are." She said it plainly, without eloquence or performance, and she meant every word in the flat, functional way of someone who has earned the right to speak without decoration. Afterward, when the room was full of conversation and the kitchen was being used and Rosa was holding court near the window with 2 of the younger women who had discovered that Rosa's particular brand of unsentimental directness was exactly what they'd been missing, Nyla went out to the garden. The light was afternoon light, not quite warm yet, but promising. The beds she had planted were showing early growth, cautious, just beginning, the tentative green of things that have been given the right conditions and are now doing what they were always capable of doing. She crouched down and looked at the soil near the base of the nearest bed, the dark, rich smell of it, the specific hope of growing things. She heard footsteps behind her on the path and knew before she turned that it was Elias. He stood at the edge of the garden bed with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at what she'd built and said nothing for a moment. "Your mother would have opinions about the spacing on that second row," he said. "I know," she said. "I did it wrong on purpose so I'd have something to fix in July." He looked at her. She looked back. There was a whole conversation in the look that they had been having slowly, in pieces, over the months since she had sat across from him at the cafe on Marchetti Street and told him as much as she could tell. They were not in a hurry. Neither of them was in a hurry for anything anymore, which was its own form of hard-won freedom. "You did a thing here," he said. "We're not done," she said. "This is the beginning." "Yeah," he said. "I know." He went back inside. She stayed in the garden. She was still there 20 minutes later when a car she recognized pulled up to the curb in front of the house. She heard it rather than saw it. The specific sound of the engine, which she knew the way you know the sounds of the life you lived for 6 years even when you have left it. She stood up slowly and walked through the side gate to the front of the house. Damien was standing on the sidewalk. He was not what she expected, which was something she noted and then set aside. She had spent enough energy over the past months not anticipating him. He looked older, which was not a dramatic difference, just the specific aging that happens to people under sustained pressure, the way stress leaves its record in a person's face, whether they invite it or not. He was not in a suit. He was in dark pants and a plain jacket, and he looked, for the first time in her memory, like a man without a performance to give. He did not come through the gate. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the house, and then at her. I'm not asking for anything, he said. The sentence was awkward in a way his sentences had never been when she'd known him. He had always spoken with the precision of a man who controlled language the way he controlled rooms. This was different. I heard about what you built. Someone mentioned it. She looked at him. Carmen Reyes? A pause. Gerald Ashworth. Of course. The connective tissue of those rooms, those galas, that world she had stepped back into one night in a sapphire dress and changed the direction of everything. She almost wanted to say it aloud, that the night he couldn't take his eyes off her had also been the night she had remembered what she was worth, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and that one of them had resulted in this garden and the women inside that building, and the other had resulted in where he was standing now. She didn't say it. It didn't need to be said. The case, she said, your cooperation. How does it look? He looked at her carefully, measuring the question. Complicated, he said. Long, ongoing. A pause. I'm restructuring the organization, the legitimate parts, voluntarily, not just... He stopped. I know that doesn't undo anything. No, she said. It doesn't. He nodded. He looked at the house again, the rebuilt porch, the fresh paint, the window boxes she'd installed last month with the same plants her mother had kept. You kept the bones, he said. It was a good house, she said, under everything. They stood on either side of the gate for a moment. The afternoon light moved across the front of the house. Inside, she could hear the sounds of voices, the kitchen, the specific warm noise of a place being used for the thing it was meant for. She looked at him, this man she had been married to for 6 years and 7 months. This man who had used her, and in some register that she no longer needed to resolve or adjudicate, had also, in his damaged way, tried to keep her at a distance from the worst of what he was. And she found that the feeling she had was neither warmth nor hatred, but something quieter and more sustainable than either. It was the specific feeling you have toward a chapter of your life that is fully, truly over, comprehensible at last. Finished. Take care of yourself, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face that she didn't try to name. You too, he said. He walked back to the car. She watched it pull away. She stood on the front path of her mother's house in the April light, and she watched the car until it was gone, and then she looked at the street, ordinary and continuing, and she breathed, in through the nose, out through the mouth, not because she was afraid. For the first time in longer than she could accurately locate, not because she was afraid. She turned around. She looked at the house, the open door, the sound of Rosa laughing at something inside, the garden beginning its slow, patient green work and the beds along the front path, the yellow and orange and deep red of the flowers visible through the front window. She walked back in. The door closed behind her. The garden kept growing, the way it had always grown, the way it would keep growing. Not because anyone was watching, not because anyone required it to, but because it had been given the right conditions and the right soil and the long, patient, unglamorous work of someone who had finally come home. And that was enough. That had always been enough.